Paul McCartney once sat in a New York hospital room beside a man he had known since he was 14 years old, holding his hand and laughing about nothing consequential, the way old friends do when they have run out of things left to argue about. The man dying in that bed was George Harrison, the youngest Beatle, the one Paul had mentored and underestimated and crowded out across a decade of the most documented creative partnership in rock music history. George died on November 29, 2001, 58 years old, taken by the lung cancer that had been pursuing him since his first diagnosis 4 years earlier. Paul faced cameras the next day and searched for what to say. He called George lovely and brave, both of which were accurate, neither of which came close to describing the weight of what the two men had actually been to each other. That weight starts accumulating in 1954, on a bus route through Liverpool, long before any of it had a name. George Harrison was 13 when he first noticed Paul McCartney carrying a guitar onto that morning bus to town. Paul was a year older, already at ease in the world in the way some teenagers naturally are, known at the Liverpool Institute High School for boys as clever and socially confident. George found the school miserable. He admitted in later years that those were the worst years of his life, a rigid environment of uniforms and class divisions that he never found his way inside. The bus route dissolved all of that. With the school day still ahead and no teachers watching, the two boys talked music, the one subject that required no particular social standing to participate in. Both were caught up in the skiffle craze moving through Britain at the time, that raw, homemade style of guitar music that convinced a generation of working-class teenagers that forming a band was genuinely within reach. From skiffle, the conversation moved naturally to Elvis Presley, to Little Richard, to Buddy Holly, all those American voices reaching across the Atlantic and landing inside Liverpool bedrooms with a force nobody had quite anticipated. George later recalled the first time he heard Heartbreak Hotel drifting from a house on his street, and the way it rearranged something inside him permanently. He went home and started drawing guitar shapes in his school notebooks, practicing chords until his fingertips ached, driven by something he couldn't fully name. Paul's musical formation ran along a different path, but pointed in the same direction. His father, Jim McCartney, had led a jazz band back in the 1920s, and Paul grew up with music functioning less like a hobby and more like the furniture of daily life, absorbing piano first and then guitar, developing an instinctive feel for melody and arrangement that would later define his entire career. When he looked at George on that bus, he recognized the same total absorption looking back at him. By 1956, George had already built a small group called the Rebels with his brother Peter and a school friend, performing whatever skiffle and early rock and roll material they could get their hands on. And that alone was enough to demonstrate that music was never going to stay casual for him. Paul joined John Lennon's group, the Quarrymen, in 1957, and when they needed a second guitarist, he pushed for George without hesitation. Lennon was unconvinced. The kid was too young, too soft-featured, not quite the image the group was assembling. The audition that ended that argument took place on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, where George sat down and played Raunchy, the rockabilly instrumental by Bill Justice, with a clean, technical precision that gave Lennon nothing left to argue against. George got the seat. With that, the essential lineup was complete, and Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison began spending enormous amounts of time together, trading chords, absorbing each other's influences, writing early, rough fragments of original songs, and allowing themselves to believe the future they imagined was actually reachable. For Paul, who had lost his mother to cancer at 14, that circle of people carried a significance that extended beyond songwriting into something closer to family. For George, being welcomed among older and more experienced players was the first real evidence that his instincts had been right all along. Beatlemania arrived and transformed all of them in ways that friendship alone could not absorb. Paul settled naturally into the role of creative engine in the recording studio, driving sessions with a producer's precision, shaping arrangements, pushing for innovation, expecting the people around him to match his level of commitment without complaint. George found the atmosphere increasingly difficult long before he said so publicly. The sessions for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967 illustrated the imbalance with a clarity that was hard to look past. The album was Paul's project in almost every essential sense, and George's single contribution, Within You, Without You, drew on years of study in Indian classical music and the teachings of Hinduism. The song was the most personal thing George had committed to record up to that point. Paul treated it as one track among many in a larger concept. George had built it from somewhere much deeper than concept, and those two ways of hearing the same piece of music revealed an incompatibility that good intentions couldn't bridge. Their 1968 visit to India for transcendental meditation instruction under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi widened the gap further. George arrived already reshaped by his commitment to meditation and spiritual practice, treating the experience with total seriousness. Paul engaged with it more loosely, and at one point told George to calm down with a joke about needing a sense of humor. George had no interest in applying humor to it. His view was that the band's commercial priorities and the relentless pressure of fame were pulling everyone away from something worth genuinely pursuing. And Paul's ability to find the whole situation slightly funny was precisely what bothered him most. The Let It Be sessions in January 1969 put every unresolved tension on film, and what the cameras captured was not comfortable viewing. Paul directed the rehearsals with the authority of someone who had been doing it for years and expected no particular pushback. George's pushback had been building for years, and when it finally arrived, it came out quiet and precise. He told Paul he would play whatever Paul wanted or simply not play at all, whichever made Paul happy, delivering the line in a tone that made its actual meaning impossible to misread. That exchange held everything the two men hadn't been able to say across a decade of recording sessions. George had accumulated a substantial body of songs, All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, Run-of-the-Mill, compositions he had developed and refined over years while the Lennon-McCartney catalog absorbed every available inch of space in each Beatles album. On January 10, 1969, he walked out of the rehearsals. He said later that staying had become unhealthy and unhappy, and that he needed to be somewhere that wasn't doing that to him. 12 days passed before he returned, and he came back only after the others acknowledged how completely the group's equilibrium depended on his presence. Neither man was under any illusion that the return resolved what had caused the departure. Wah Wah, the song George wrote on the very day he walked out, made the emotional record audible in every chord. A private conversation that writer Anthony Fawcett later documented showed Paul admitting to Lennon that George's songwriting had finally reached the level of theirs. When that account reached George, he rejected it, insisting he had been writing at that standard for years and had simply never been given the space to show it. The disagreement about when something was recognized versus when it was actually achieved was one they never resolved. Abbey Road that same year delivered the vindication without requiring anyone's permission to grant it. Here Comes the Sun and Something arrived as two of the album's most lasting pieces. Frank Sinatra described Something as the greatest love song ever written. John Lennon called it the best thing on the record. After years of watching his work treated as secondary material, George received that response with a satisfaction he had been accumulating for a long time. The Beatles dissolved regardless. Paul released his debut solo album, McCartney, in 1970. George followed with All Things Must Pass, a triple album drawing on the years of material the band had consistently set aside, a record so assured and fully realized that it redefined what critics thought George had always been capable of. Solo careers developed in parallel, but without warmth. George told interviewers he could imagine performing again with John Lennon, but not with Paul. When the Concert for Bangladesh was organized in 1971, an early landmark in the history of charity concerts in rock music, Paul was invited and offered logistical concerns as his reason for declining. The gap held and widened. It started closing in 1994. George, Paul, and Ringo gathered at McCartney's recording studio on February 11th to work on unfinished John Lennon demo recordings, and the press christened them the Threetles. George arrived with conditions. He insisted that his friend Jeff Lynne serve as producer, warning Paul directly that without an external hand, the sessions could turn adversarial with all that accumulated history in the room. Paul later quoted George's exact words, "No, we need a producer. It could get nasty." Free as a Bird and Real Love were completed and reached an audience that had been waiting decades for anything new from the three of them. Paul wanted the recordings to carry the signature sound of the classic Beatles era. George pushed for simplicity and followed his own melodic instincts. They disagreed on specifics throughout and finished the work anyway, which was its own kind of progress. During this period, Paul began publicly correcting something he had held for too long, calling George a late bloomer who ultimately wrote some of the finest songs ever produced. A characterization George might have received more warmly if the late bloomer framing hadn't itself been part of the problem. The throat cancer diagnosis came in 1997. Lung cancer followed. A brain tumor arrived later. In November 1999, an intruder entered Friar Park and attacked George with a knife, leaving physical damage that didn't fully reverse. Paul visited through the illness, and the arguments that had once felt indispensable gradually lost their urgency as the timeline compressed. In that hospital room in New York, they sat together and joked about ordinary things and held hands, and Paul described it afterward as feeling like they were dreaming side by side. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, and his ashes were scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India. In keeping with his Hindu faith and his lifelong relationship with Indian spirituality and meditation. A fir tree George once gave Paul still grows beside the gate of Paul's home, and Paul says hello to it quietly each time he walks past. Johnny Harrison and Stella McCartney have stayed close, carrying forward not the conflict, but the underlying bond their fathers shared across 50 years of friendship, rivalry, silence, and something that was always, beneath everything else, brotherhood. The rivalry had a definite end. The brotherhood never did.